Welcome again to Survey of Church History. We are in, according to my syllabus here, my hand, we are in Lecture 11, and we have covered the Reformation in Germany and in Switzerland and France. Now we come to the Reformation as it was carried out in the Netherlands. There was no unity among the Lutherans or Zwinglians and Anabaptists. They had a lot of different doctrinal differences. But the ideas of John Calvin, or the Reformed ideas, finally dominated, and the followers of Zwingli and Calvin, and of course the Zwinglians went over to Calvin after Zwingli died. The followers of Zwingli and Calvin were known as the Reformed, and they differed from the Lutherans and a few things like the Lord's Supper, and they carried the Reformation a little bit further doctrinally than the Lutherans did. In 1561, the Belgic, B-E-L-G-I-C, the Belgic Confession was adopted by the church in the Netherlands, the Belgic Confession as a statement of faith. And also they adopted a church order, which was concerned with the government of the local church. They adopted a church order like Calvin's church order in Geneva. It was modeled after Calvin's church order. Which brings us now to the Reformation in Scotland, 1557 to 1570. Scotland was a very poor country, and the Roman Catholic clergy were very corrupted there. Luther's teachings had some influence. Tyndale and Coverdale had influenced the country because of the Bible translations. Gradually, however, Calvinism, out of Geneva, Switzerland, John Calvin's Reformed teachings dominated in Scotland. Now, John Knox, K-N-O-X, John Knox, 1554 to 1555, that's the area that we're talking about. There's John up on the screen. John was born in 1515, and he was ordained a Roman Catholic priest in 1547. And he was impressed with Calvin, and he visited Geneva, and later he came back to Scotland and preached, having been influenced by John Calvin in Geneva. He supported the Reformed movement, the Calvinistic theology, and even while in Geneva, he would encourage the Reformed Calvinistic group in Scotland by letters wherein he would write them advice. In 1557, the Scot Protestants united together under what they called the Common Band, or the first Scottish Covenant, and that was the union of all the Protestants in Scotland. And John Knox went back over to his homeland in Scotland from Geneva, where he was in 1559, and he preached, and he attacked the papacy, and he attacked the Mass, and he attacked idolatries in the Roman Church. And Protestantism was decreed to be the national religion of Scotland. And all Catholic jurisdiction, all the rights of the Catholic Church to exist in Scotland were abolished. And the country adopted a Calvinistic statement of faith. There's John Knox preaching in Scotland, and he was a fiery preacher, even as the picture indicates. So the Protestants suppressed the Catholics in Scotland. Now, the first book of discipline was presented to the Scot Parliament in 1561, and it applied the church government of Calvin, the Reformed style of church government, for the whole country of Scotland. So the whole country of Scotland adopted the Reformed type of government that originated with John Calvin. That was written up in the first book of discipline. 1564, Knox prepared the Book of Common Order, which dealt with the style or the format of public worship, and that also was modeled on what Calvin had written previously about church order, about the order of worship in the service. So the church at the Geneva became the pattern. Calvin's church at the Geneva became the pattern for the Huguenot church, for the Protestants in France, for the Reformed churches in the Netherlands, and for the Reformed, or now to be called the Presbyterian church in Scotland. The church in Scotland became known as the Presbyterian church because of the kind of government it had presbyters. It was a church that espoused Reformed Calvinistic theology. So the Presbyterian church was firmly rooted in Scotland, this Calvinistic Reformed theological vehicle, you might say. The Presbyterian church was firmly rooted in Scotland by 1570. Now, Knox had consolidated the Scot Reformation by the Confession of Faith of 1560, by the Book of Discipline, by the Book of Common Order, by Calvin's Catechism, which he introduced. And Knox died in 1572, but he reformed the Scotch Church and molded the character of Scotland itself more than any other individual. John Knox, this Catholic priest who became a Calvinist and sympathetic to Reformed theology and an institutor of the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, he molded Scotland religiously and nationally more than any other individual. Now I want to show you a map that we're going to put up on the screen, which shows the effects of the Reformation in Europe. Now this map is of different colors, and the basic background of the map is light green. It's light green, and you'll see that on your screen. There it is. That's Europe. Off to the left you can see England and Scotland, and you see the different colors. Well, light green, which is the basic background of the map, that indicates the Catholic areas of Europe. So at one time, you know, Europe was all light green, so to speak. Then you see the brown. The brown, that's the Anglican, like over there in England. You can see what brown is on the map there by looking at England. That's Anglican. The blue dots are the Anabaptist settlements, the real radical reformers. The red, and look at Scotland for red, and Switzerland, the red are the Calvinistic and Zwinglian areas. And the dark green, which take up north central Europe and Scandinavia, the dark green are the Lutheran areas. So the map, the religious map of Europe really radically changed after the Reformation. At one point, just imagine in your mind that it was all light green. It was all basically light green. And now it's a multicolored map because of the Protestant Reformation as it was carried out under some different theologies in different countries. Now the Council of Trent. Trent is a city in Italy. The Roman Catholic Church had a major council at Trent. The Reformation had spread, and there had been attempts by the emperor to unite Catholics and Protestants, but they failed. So Pope Paul III called the Council of Trent Now, the dates of this council were 1545 to 1563. And this council formulated a creed for the Catholic Church. It adopted a catechism, a question and answer booklet on the faith. It corrected many abuses of the Roman Church, and there you see a picture of the final session of the Council of Trent there up on your screen now. It provides for a better education of the clergy. It clearly established the supremacy of the Pope, and it effected some reform in the Roman Church. But the Catholic system was reasserted and upheld. So the Council of Trent is a Roman Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. And the response was, you know, we have cleaned up some abuses, but basically we have not changed, and we reaffirm our doctrinal position. And so they rejected the theologies of the Protestant Reformation. So the Catholic system was reasserted and upheld, and the Council of Trent is called the Counter-Reformation. It was the counteracting response of the Roman Church to the Protestant Reformation. So the Council of Trent is known as the Counter-Reformation, and it drew the line. It drew the line between Catholicism and Protestantism, and the Council of Trent was the main influence, doctrinal, disciplinary influence in the Roman Catholic Church up until the, I would say, the Second Vatican Council in our own time. In 1564, the teachings of the Council of Trent were summarized by the Tridentine profession of faith. Let me put that up on the board. The Tridentine, the Tridentine profession of faith. That simply means a statement of the doctrines reasserted by the Council of Trent. Tridentine simply means relative to the Council of Trent. That's the statement of Catholic belief that came out of the Council of Trent. And all Catholic clergy and teachers and converts had to subscribe to that profession of faith, or a shorter form taken from that profession. People are baptized, people are going to teach in Catholic schools, people are going to be ordained Catholic priests, whatever. They had to solemnly subscribe to that statement of faith. Now, this time, the Inquisition was started up again after the Reformation. The Inquisition, in a more tactful form almost, in a little more sophisticated form, but the Inquisition was reasserted, and now it was called the Supreme Sacred Congregation of the Holy Office. So the Holy Office was a department in Rome, which was in effect a renewal of the Inquisition because it was a watchdog in matters of doctrinal error. It's called the Roman Inquisition. The Holy Office is called the Roman Inquisition, 1542. And it was controlled by the papacy, and it was an instrument of reform, for doctrinal rectitude, and it employed coercion, censorship, propaganda, terror, torture, and execution. So even in the latter time of the Protestant Reformation, the Catholic Church was still going about this type of activity to stamp out error. Now, Pope Paul IV, 1555 to 1559, his years as Pope, Paul IV published the Index, I-N-D-E-X, the Index, which was a list of prohibited books. books that the Roman Church would not allow people to read because they, in the feeling of the Roman Church, would undermine the Roman Catholic faith. And by 1564, almost 3/4 of the books printed in Europe were on that index. And finally, the index was abolished in 1966. So the index was, abolished just some 25 years ago or so. And I can well recall the index and books on the index, and is that book on the index, and are you allowed to possess it or have it, and so on and so forth. Well, they finally abolished the index in 1966. But at one time, about 3/4 of all the books printed in Europe were on this index. And you were a suspect, of course. It was bad news if you were harboring these books. Now, the 30 Years' War. The 30 Years' War. We spoke about the 30 Years' War before. And 1618 to 1648, Europe was in the turmoil of the 30 Years' War. The Peace of Augsburg, remember that? The Peace of Augsburg had allowed that each prince could determine the religion of his territory, and if a Catholic prince became Protestant, he had to give up his territory. And I said then that provision would lead to bloodshed. And princes who converted to Protestantism, Catholic princes, however, who converted to Protestantism, made their territory Protestant. They did not give up their territory according to the agreement of the Peace of Augsburg, but they made their territory Protestant. So they violated the Augsburg Agreement. So also there was dissatisfaction among the Lutherans and the Catholics. The Calvinists, who had no relevancy to the Peace of Augsburg, they wanted some legal recognition and so forth. They were not a part of the Augsburg Agreement. And so, so the Protestants organized the Evangelical Union in 1608, and the Catholics organized the Catholic League in 1609, and war erupted between the various Protestant bodies and the Catholics, the Evangelical Union and the Catholic League. And that war ended with the Peace of Westphalia. It lasted for 30 years, tremendous bloodshed. The Catholics and the Protestants just warring on one another, just killing one another. And it ended with the Peace of Westphalia. Millions, literally millions, died in that war. Some of the provisions of the Peace of Westphalia were that Holland and Switzerland became independent Protestant states. Lutheranism and Calvinism were recognized as legally established religions. They had a legal status, the Calvinists and the Lutherans. A change in religion and the part of a prince would not affect his subjects. Austria and Bohemia became Catholic states with no Protestant privileges. So the compromise solutions. Some states became Catholic, some Protestant. If a man changed his religion, it would not affect his subjects. Now, the Peace of Westphalia, this excuse me, this peace that settled the 30 Years' War, drew the line between the Protestants and the Catholics, between Protestantism and Catholicism, and ended the period of the Reformation on the European continent. So the Peace of Westphalia brings us to the end of the Reformation on the continent. Now we come to the Reformation in England, which is rather complicated. Let me suggest here that you look at your syllabus in regard to this matter here of the Reformation in England, And it's, if you look on page 2 of the syllabus for lecture 11, we see the matter at hand beginning with Roman numeral 8, the Reformation in England. And you might just want to kind of keep that material in front of you as I speak. And of course, you'll go over it for your study, for your test and everything. But that will provide you sort of with a track to run on as I'm lecturing. So if you get a little confused, you can look and say, well, now he's here, and all that. So I'm going to have to kind of move on this. And so the Reformation in England, well, this Reformation went through 4 stages under 4 rulers. Henry VIII, who began to rule in 1509. Edward VI, who followed him, his son, 1547. Mary, one of Henry's daughters, 1553. And Elizabeth, another daughter, 1558. So the Reformation in England was very topsy-turvy, very back and forth. And it is outlined by the rule of 4 English sovereigns, Henry VIII and his children, Edward VI, Mary, and Elizabeth. Now there is a mood of nationalism in England. They're becoming very nationalistic in their thinking. They began to resent all the tax money going to the papacy. They began to see the Pope as a foreign prince, almost more than being a spiritual leader, although that was certainly not ruled out. And so that was these are kind of mood-setting factors to enhance the issues at hand. Now, in 1521, Henry VIII attacked Luther's work that we spoke about, the Babylonian captivity. He attacked Luther's work on the sacraments, and the King of England, who's Catholic, wrote in defense of the 7 sacraments. He's a Catholic king, and he wrote in defense of the 7 sacraments. And the Pope awarded him with the title Defender of the Faith. There's Henry VIII there looking at you out of the screen. And he was named by the Pope. He was a Catholic monarch of England, and he was named by the Pope as Defender of the Faith, which is still a title of the ruling monarch of England, even though that monarch is now Protestant. They still hold that as one of their official titles, Defender of the Faith. But now to Rome's chagrin, they are the defenders of the Protestant faith instead of the Catholic faith, although they first received the title from the Pope. I think that's one of the ironies of history. So, Henry VIII, all right, now, he married Catherine of Aragon. Now, instead of running back and forth to the board, for the sake of time, I want you to just follow your outline as I speak about these people. Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, all the various wives of Henry. So we'll just go through this smoother if you just keep one eye on your notepad and one eye on your syllabus. So it has to be kind of, I think they call it being wall-eyed. I'm not certain, but that's better than being cross-eyed. So, so just keep an eye on both, and and we'll be able to get through this a little more smoothly. All right. Now, Henry married Catherine of Aragon, who was the widow of his deceased brother Arthur. This was a violation to marry your brother's wife. Is a violation of the law of Moses, a biblical law in the law of Moses, and is a violation of Catholic Church law. However, the Pope Julius II, granted a dispensation or granted permission for that marriage. But by 1527, Henry didn't want that marriage anymore, and he said that marriage, of course, it was just an excuse. But he cited religious scruples or an upset conscience. That conscience was upset about that marriage, whether that marriage was valid or not. And he desired to have a male heir to prevent a civil war at his death. he wanted a male heir. Well, he only had a daughter. It got to the point where he didn't think that Catherine was going to give him a son. And all he had was a daughter whose name was Mary. And so he had to get rid of Catherine and marry another woman who might give him a son. So his advisor was the reigning Bishop of England, Cardinal Wolsey. And Cardinal Wolsey was told to contact the Pope, Pope Clement VII, and get an annulment of the marriage to Catherine. So have the church decree that marriage is null and void, so he can go marry somebody else. However, secretly, now Henry already loves Anne Boleyn, okay? And he secretly marries her. But Wolsey failed in his mission to the Pope, and the Pope would not grant an annulment to the king about his first marriage. And so Henry was about to try Wolsey for treason for failing in his mission, but fortunately for Wolsey, he just died. And it was very convenient. And now, so when Wolsey died, Thomas Cromwell became Henry's chief advisor. Thomas Cromwell became Henry's chief advisor. And Thomas Cranmer became the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is the reigning Bishop of England. And this Thomas Cranmer, who you see on your screen now, was to become the first Protestant Archbishop. And the first Protestant Archbishop and Archbishop of Canterbury. And so now Henry, because of a disappointment, because he couldn't get his marriage to Catherine annulled, well, then he's going to do it himself through his own agency with the Archbishop of Canterbury. So he forced the clergy, he really blackmailed almost the clergy. I won't go into all that detail, but he forced the English clergy to declare him the head of the church in England. And he forced the clergy to declare that he was the supreme and single Lord of the church in England, as far as the law of Christ allows, even the supreme head. So now Henry gets voted in by forcing the clergy. He gets voted in to be the supreme head of the church in England, which makes the Pope irrelevant. All right? So, in 1533, Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. And Thomas Cranmer now had been confirmed as the Archbishop of Canterbury by the Pope, and so consecrated. And now Cranmer, who owed his archbishopric really to Henry, all right, Cranmer and his marriage court, his ecclesiastical marriage court, judged Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, to be null and void. So what the Pope didn't do for Henry, the Archbishop of Canterbury did in England, and declared Henry's first marriage to Catherine null and void. But Catherine wasn't going to be put down, and she did not accept the competence of Cranmer's court. And the Pope stood with Catherine. And so the Pope excommunicated the king. The Pope excommunicated the king in 1534. And so now the king is excommunicated. But now Anne Boleyn, his new wife, bore Henry a daughter. So he must have been very disappointed because he's looking for his son. So she bears him a daughter, Elizabeth. Now all these people are going to figure in. So Elizabeth is born, and eventually she would become queen. Now other steps were now taken to sever the English church from the papacy. Now the there's a rift between the king and the Pope. But remember, England, including the king, are totally Catholic in doctrine. They're totally Roman Catholic in doctrine. The only difference is the king asserts himself as the head of the church in England, and he doesn't accept the jurisdiction of the Pope over England. So, so the steps now taken to sever the English church from the papacy. The bishops were elected only by the king's nomination, so he got control of the clergy. Taxes, payments to Rome were stopped. Obedience to the Pope, the oaths of obedience were abolished. The most important step was the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy of 1534, which made the break with Rome complete. The Act of Supremacy. And that declared that Henry and his successors to be the only supreme head on earth of the Church of England. That's the Act of Supremacy that declared Henry and his successors to be the only supreme head of the Church of England. Then they had the Act of Succession, which assured the throne of England to the children of Henry and Anne Boleyn. Okay. Now, everybody didn't accept this Act of Supremacy. And so some rose up in rebellion against the Act of Supremacy, against not having the Pope as the head of the church, but having the king. So to take care of this, they established the law of treason and heresy. It was treason not to accept the king as the head of the church, and it was heresy to accept anything except Catholic doctrine. So it was all Catholic doctrine, but the king was to be the head. Some revolted against, like Bishop John Fisher and Sir Thomas More, the Exchequer of England, and so some were martyrs, some were put to death by the king because they would not accept him as the head of the church. Again, England was Orthodox except for the substitution of the king as the head of the church. Now Henry authorized an English translation of the Bible. He authorized an English translation of the Bible, which was published in 1539. That was known as the Great Bible, It was a revision by Coverdale of Matthew's Bible, which contained some of Tyndale's work. That's the Bible that is also known as the chained Bible, because it was chained to the reading stands in every church, so people couldn't walk off with it, like a Bell telephone book is chained to the telephone booth. While the Bible was chained, not to keep it from the laity, but the Bible was chained to the reading stand, so it would be there for everybody to read, and so people wouldn't walk off with it. Now, in 1539, Parliament passed 6 articles, which were an abbreviated statement of Roman Catholic doctrine. Now, Henry got tired of Anne Boleyn, and so she was accused of adultery, and she was beheaded. And then Henry married Jane Seymour. Now, Jane Seymour bore him a son. This is what he'd been looking for. So finally, Jane Seymour bears him a son, Edward. But she died 12 days after the death of the birth of Edward. And then he married Anne of Cleves, and who was a sister-in-law of Frederick of Saxony in Europe, trying to cement some good international relationships. He marries Anne of Cleves. And, but that marriage was annulled, and Cromwell was beheaded over that because he had advised the king to marry Anne of Cleves, and it was a bad decision. The king decided after he had made that decision, so he beheaded the one who gave him the advice. And it's called blame shifting. Henry then married Catherine Howard, and she was beheaded by the king because she had questionable conduct. So Henry was rather a difficult person to get along with. In 1543, Henry married Catherine Parr, and she had the blessed good fortune to outlive him. And so he died in 1547. Now, Henry VIII was succeeded by his son. Now, he had 2 daughters and a son, but different wives. So he's succeeded by his male heir, first of all, Edward. And Edward was followed by Mary, who was the child of his first wife, Catherine of Catherine of Aragon. And Mary would be followed by Elizabeth. When Henry died, the English church was a national church. But it was national in character. It was Roman Catholic in doctrine. And Edward was to carry out the religious phase of the Reformation. Now, Edward VI, 1547, he took the throne. He was 9 years old. He was under the guidance of his uncle, Duke of Somerset. And, of course, Edward was Protestant by birth. And so the 6 Articles and the laws of treason, let me see. I said he was Protestant by birth. Edward, his mother was Jane Seymour. Well, under the influence of his uncle, he became Protestant. And the 6 Articles, or the Statement of Catholic Faith, and the laws of treason and heresy were repealed. And the Act of Uniformity of 1549 required the use of the Book of Common Prayer. So the Book of Common Prayer came in under Edward, and that was revised in 1552. So you had 2 books of Common Prayer. The second prayer book of Edward, or the second Book of Common Prayer, was a revision of the first. And that became the basis of the religious life in England. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who Henry had set in, developed a creed with the aid of John Knox and others. And this creed was called the 42 Articles. So the 42 Articles became the creed of the English church, the Protestant creed of the English church. So now England is going Protestant, or Anglican, the English church Anglican, not Roman, but Anglican or Protestant in its doctrine. Now, Mary Tudor, 1553, she's the daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. See, so she's Catholic. By circumstances, she's 100% Catholic. And Parliament declared her mother's marriage to the king valid again after the thing was disavowed before. And so she's Catholic, and she's got an axe to grind. And she repealed all the laws that favored Protestantism. She repealed all those laws that were enacted under Edward. And all the clergy favoring the Reformation had to flee England for Europe because she started to persecute all the, quote, Protestant clergy. And under Mary, the Pope was restored as the head of the church in England. And the Reformation was completely undone. The Reformation in England was completely undone, and England was returned to the Catholic Church under Mary. Cranmer, the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, had been the moving force of the Reformation. He's the one whose marriage court had nullified the marriage between Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, and the king. So she put him to death for nullifying a parent's marriage. So Archbishop Cranmer, the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury, was put to death under Mary. Burned at the stake, as a matter of fact. Then we come to Elizabeth, 1558. Now Elizabeth had to face religious division in Europe, and she succeeded to the sovereignty because she was a descendant of Henry, and she had no religious feeling, but she was really Protestant because her parents' marriage was not recognized by the Roman Church between the king and her mother, and so she was necessarily Protestant. And Elizabeth reestablished the Reformation. Elizabeth reestablished the Reformation, and she made some concessions to the Catholics. So in 1559, she enacted a New Supremacy Act, that was established by Parliament. It rejected the authority of the Pope and established Elizabeth as the supreme governor, not the head. This was a concession to the Catholics. She was acknowledged as the supreme governor. There on the screen you see her signing this document, where she is the supreme governor of the Church of England. The second prayer book of Edward VI, or the Book of Common Prayer, was revised, so some offensive portions and offensive to Roman Catholics were changed, like the prayer against the Pope in the second prayer book of Edward were omitted, things like that. Things that would be a positive offense to the Roman Catholics, she omitted. And now she appointed Matthew Parker as the Archbishop of Canterbury, and he was consecrated a bishop not according to the Roman Catholic liturgy, which speaks of ordaining one to a priesthood when they do when they ordain a bishop, but he was ordained according to the religious ceremony set forth in the second book of Common Prayer, well, according to the Edwardine ordinal, or the formula set forth under Protestant Edward. And so there's no mention of priesthood in his consecration as bishop. So Rome said that cut England off from this apostolic succession, that their priests, that their bishops were not true successors of the apostles because they weren't priests. And so that was always a big flap between Rome and England. And they've been trying to get that thing worked out into modern times because the forms of ordination used, the form of ordination used for Matthew Parker, which would affect all those he would ordain, didn't conform to Roman standards theologically. Now, the 42 Articles under Elizabeth, the 42 Articles, which had become the statement of faith for Protestant England, were revised, and they became the 39 Articles. So they became the creed of the Anglican Church, the 39 Articles. Now, all these conciliatory measures were known as the Elizabethan settlement, Elizabethan settlement. So the Queen called herself the supreme governor of the church, and not the head, although she actually was. The Articles, the creed was reduced from 42 to 39 because they took out some articles offensive to Roman Catholics. The second prayer book of Edward was revised to take out offense and so forth. And so that's called the Elizabethan settlement. Now in 1570, Pius V, Pope Pius V, excommunicated Elizabeth. And he freed her subjects from allegiance to her. So he tried to take her kingdom away from her by telling the people in England, don't obey the Queen, obey me. So he tried to destroy Protestants. See, the Pope went all out to destroy Protestantism in England. The Pope also influenced Philip of Spain, King Philip of Spain, to attack England and to recover England for the Roman Catholic Church. And so the Spanish sent an armada of boats. They sent the Spanish Armada against England. Military might, at the behest of the Pope, sent against England to conquer England so that the Spanish king could give England back to the papacy, so the Pope could once more be the spiritual head of England. But the English fleet defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. And this was the last hope of Rome. This was the last hope of Rome to regain England for itself. So that takes care of that part of the Reformation of England. And we'll continue now with the aftermath of all of that, and we'll start with the Puritans. Now, as we continue with the Puritans, first of all, I want to tell you that this begins Lecture 12 according to the syllabus that I have here. And you see at Roman numeral 1, church handout number 2. This has been a church handout to the classes, and you'll see all that is listed in the handout under Roman numeral 1, A through Q. Puritans to William Carey. Excuse me. I'm going to go over that handout with you in class today. And so just take your handout, which is printed up, and just follow through. And you can go back for a more particular reference later, but I think it'd be good if I go over that in class with you and just hit about 90% of it anyway with you. So as I go through this material from the Puritans down through William Carey, you can just follow along in your printed handout material. Make it easier for you. Now, I'm not going to just read it word for word, but you'll just follow along, okay? Now, the Puritans, well, Protestants had fled to Geneva during Mary's persecution in England. Remember, she was a Catholic queen, and she restored the papacy as the head of the Church of England, and she was violently opposed to Protestantism in England. So many Protestants, Anglicans, Protestants, whatever, fled England, and some went to Geneva. And they were influenced by Calvinism at Geneva, so they returned to England, and England is now being ruled by Elizabeth, who's a Protestant monarch. But these people some felt that the church wasn't purified enough, so they were called Puritans because they wanted to reform the church from all indications of the Roman Catholic religion, kneeling, vestments, all the type of a thing, ruled by the local bishop, all the type of thing. They sought to rid the church totally of any aspect of Roman Catholicism. So they sought to change church government from the rule of the bishops to the rule of the presbyters or local elders. So it's called Presbyterian rule after presbyter. They wanted the local church ruled by local elders instead of by the bishop. And so these people, these Puritans, attempted to purify the church not by leaving it, but purify it from within. Sometimes they're called independents. And their leader was Thomas Cartwright. Now the separatists were also Puritans, but they felt that it was hopeless to try to purify the church from within, so they separated themselves from the church itself because they saw that it'd be impossible to purify the church from within. And they entered into a church covenant Of course, the Church of England, Protestant though it was a state church, a union church and state, even though it was Protestant. These Puritans that separated themselves from the state church are now called separatists. And again, they believed that reform from within would take too long and it would be hopeless. And they were led by Robert Brown, John Greenwood, and Henry Barrow. These people would eventually become Congregationalists. The Congregationalists, the Congregational Church is a big church up in New England, up in the northeast part of these United States. But the Congregational Church began in England. Congregationalists are those who believe in congregational government and so forth. And the first Congregational churches began in England, and they were, that church came from the Separatists under the leadership mainly of Robert Brown. Now John Robison fled with some Separatists from Scrooby, England to Leyden, Holland. Now these are the people, these Separatists are the ones that eventually came to America on the Mayflower. And we're going to show you a picture of the Mayflower. There's a picture of the Mayflower on the screen. That's a picture of, not the actual Mayflower, but a replica of the Mayflower. And that's what they crossed the ocean in. They were known as the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were Separatists, who fled to Holland. And from there, they touched base in England, and then they sailed to the Americas. And in 1629, the Puritan Anglicans, all right, the Puritan Anglicans, so the Separatists landed at Plymouth Rock. All right, in 1629, the Puritan Anglicans, those loyal to the state church, who despised the Separatists, they're all Puritans, but the ones who stayed in the, they're all the same theology, basically, but the ones that stayed in the church, Puritans, despised the ones that left the church, the Separatists, because they left the church. And so the Puritans, who were still loyal to the state church of England, came and they landed and settled, they settled the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So you have the Separatists at Plymouth Rock, south of Boston, and then you have the Puritans up in the Boston area, with Salem and so forth, and they established the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Now eventually, the Puritans that established the Massachusetts Bay Colony, eventually they became Separatists. They saw the hopelessness of trying to change the church from within, the state church. So they finally made peace with the Separatists in Plymouth and so forth. And so finally they themselves became Separatists. Now, 1606, Separatists fled England, some fled England under the direction of John Smith. And they returned to England when the persecution was over. And under the direction of Thomas Helwys and John Merton, the First Baptist Church was established in England near London. Not the First Baptist Church, but the First Baptist Church was established in England, and they were Separatists under the direction of Helwys. Now these Baptists were called General Baptists. They're called General Baptists because because of their Arminian theology, they were called General Baptists. In other words, they believed that anybody could be saved. I believe that's why they call General Baptists, as opposed to Particular Baptists, which is hyper-Calvinism. Only certain ones were foreordained to be saved. Now, in 1633, John Spilsbury led a group in a split from state church Puritans Now, Spilsbury group believed in baptism by immersion for believers and in particular atonement for the elect. That was Calvinism, that only certain ones are foreordained to be saved. So they were called particular Baptists, particular Baptists. So they were very hyper-Calvinistic. According to Calvin's doctrine and doctrine of predestination, only certain ones were destined to be saved. Well, these people believed that. Not that everybody that salvation was for everybody, but only for certain ones. So they're called particular Baptists. And these people, first of all, led by John Spilsbury, these are the ancestors of the Baptist people, of the Baptist movement in America. They're the ancestors of the people who established Baptist churches in America, these particular Baptists. Now let's talk about King James I. King James I. Now, Elizabeth passes off the scene. James I, 1603. Now, he succeeded Elizabeth on the English throne. The Puritans wanted a Presbyterian, like elder government in the state Anglican Church. So they signed the Millenary Petition, to that effect. But James did not grant a change in government from bishops to elders in the local church. James I, Protestant James, did not grant that permission, but he did grant permission for a New English translation of the Bible, and that was completed in 1611, and it was known as the Authorized, or the King James Version. And the Authorized or King James Version eventually replaced the Geneva Bible for Calvinistic England. So that's the origin of the King James Bible. Now we come to Charles I, who began to reign in 1625. The Puritans were oppressed for 40 years. After Elizabeth, the Puritans, those who stayed in the church and wanted to reform it, they were oppressed. And in 1640, the Parliament was made up mostly of people who were sympathetic to the Puritans and who were Presbyterian in their thinking, or that kind of church government. Well, most of the Parliament were Presbyterian believers. And their chief oppressor was Archbishop Laud, L-A-U-D. And so Charles I brought military force against the Presbyterian Puritans, which caused a civil war. This was the war between the Puritan Roundheads, called the Roundheads, led by Oliver Cromwell, and the Cavaliers, or the King's Men. And the Roundheads, the Puritans, defeated the King's army at Naseby. And Charles I, the king, was executed by hanging. So the Presbyterians, the Puritans, hung the king because he came against them. And so the Civil War happened among these Protestants. What kind of government, how far is the Reformation going to go in the Church of England? Well, the Puritans, the Reformation didn't go far enough. And they want to take all the vestiges of Romanism and even change the church government. And so the Protestants, quote unquote, were divided themselves about how far this whole thing should go. And it ends up in a civil war between the Roundheads or the Presbyterians, and they were led by Oliver Cromwell. And they won against the king's forces, who was non-Puritan, and so they hung the king. Meanwhile, the Puritan Parliament abolished the Episcopal Church government and called the Westminster Assembly. And so the Parliament set forth a new form of church government for the church, a new directory of worship, all this being done for Parliament. And they also established the Westminster Confession, the Westminster Confession, which is the last of the great Reformation creeds, the Westminster Confession, a very good statement of biblical faith. By 1648, the State Church of England was Calvinistic and Presbyterian. It was Calvinistic in doctrine, Presbyterian in government. They also put out the larger and the shorter catechism, statements of faith, and which contain the truths of Reformed doctrine. The Westminster Confession, this great Calvinistic statement of faith, was also established, accepted in Scotland. Now, after the Civil War, Cromwell, who had led the Puritans to victory, ruled England as a dictator. And, but he died, and the son of Charles I, Charles II, was crowned, and this is called, so the crown went back to the House of Stuart, from where Charles came from. So it's called the Restoration of 1660. So by this time, Parliament now is ruled by non-Puritans. So the face of Parliament has changed, and it's ruled by non-Puritan Anglicans. So they issued the Clarendon Code, the Clarendon Code. And this legislation established that only non-Puritans, only Anglicans, non-Puritans of the Church of England could hold state or church positions. You couldn't hold a state position, you couldn't hold a church position if you were a Puritan. So the Puritans were persecuted, and they were hanged, they were drowned, and so they were called nonconformists and dissenters. So from here on, the Puritans were called nonconformists and dissenters. And so they were forced into the same position that was originally taken by the separatists. They just had to leave the establishment. Now James II comes to the throne. Very interesting, because James II now just happens to be a zealous Roman Catholic. So here, so all of a sudden, up on the scene, by succession, the ruling monarch now happens to be a zealous Catholic, and he was the brother of Charles II. And James II declared tolerance. He declared tolerance for the Catholics and for all dissenters. And but the fact that he was a Catholic brought a lot of resentment and a lot of fear in England that there was a Catholic on the throne, especially after Elizabeth's decrees. And James plotted with Louis XIV of France to have England restored to the authority of the Roman Church. So like Paul V consorted with the King of Spain to defeat England and bring it under the authority of the Roman Church. So now James II plots with King Louis XIV of France, the same thing, to have the King of France dominate England and bring France under the spiritual authority of Rome. In response to an appeal from the English people, so the English people found out about this. They were not going to tolerate it. So they cried out to William III of the Netherlands, who was the king of the Netherlands, called William of Orange. He's Protestant, okay? William of Orange. And they cried out to him, and he drove James II from England. He came over, and he attacked England. So before Louis XIV could attack England for the Pope, William III of Orange of the Netherlands attacked England for the Protestants. And he drove James II from the throne of England. And so he saved England and America for Protestantism. He saved England for Protestantism. And by that token, America, because many of our people come from there. In 1689, the English Bill of Rights declared that no Roman Catholic could wear the crown. No Roman Catholic could ever wear the crown in England. And also the Toleration Act allowed dissenters, Baptists and Quakers, to exist along with the state church. But the Act of Toleration, see, it was still a state church, but now it's like a Puritan state church. Okay. And an Act of Toleration was issued for the benefit of those who weren't Puritans as such, for instance, the Baptists and the Quakers and so forth, but no Act of Toleration was extended to the Catholics. Jacob Arminius was a man who modified Calvinistic theology, and so his doctrine is known as Arminianism. He stressed the role of man in his own salvation, and he stressed that man could lose his salvation. He did not subscribe to Calvin's position that we have eternal security, that once saved, always saved. He said a man can lose his salvation almost because of any sin, or because of any sin. The Synod of Dort, D-O-R-T, the Synod of Dort rejected Arminianism in the Netherlands, and but Jacob Arminius' teaching became part of the theology of the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, and the Salvation Army. So the Anglican Church and the Methodist Church and the Salvation Army teach that man can lose his salvation by committing sin. And of course, Calvin states that once saved, always saved. You cannot lose your salvation once you are saved. There is a middle ground, not Arminian, not eternal security, but the middle ground, theologically, is the security of the believer. That apostasy is possible, but highly unlikely, that we are kept by God in every little sin, because we are in a blood covenant with God. Every sin does not automatically damn us, but we can fall away from God through repeated sins and a series of unrepentances where our heart can grow cold and God can give us up and we can fall away. But that's not a likely matter for a sincere Christian. However, so there are different points of view in this area. Now, the Quakers, this movement was led by George Fox, 1624. Now, the Quakers arrived on the scene at the time of the Civil War in England, at the time of the war between the Roundheads and the Cavaliers in England. Now, they rejected all churches. The Quakers just gave up on the whole mess. I mean, they just got fed up with all the going back and forth and the fightings and the dissension and the arguments. And so they just gave up. They said, in effect, I imagine, can this be God? And so they rejected all creeds. They rejected all theology. They rejected everything. They just depended on what they called the inner light of the Spirit. And they called themselves the Society of Friends. In 4 years, they grew from 60, just 60, to 30,000. They would meet together, very simple, no liturgy, no anything. They'd all sit, and they'd sit together in silence until the Spirit moved on somebody to speak. And they didn't do anything unless they felt that they were responding to the inner light of the move of the Spirit. They called themselves the Society of Friends. Remember, Jesus said, I no longer call you whatever, but I call you friends. Now, Pietism and the Moravians. We talked about the Moravians. 1670, Philip Spener. It says Spencer here in these notes I have. I hope by the time you get it's corrected. Spener, S-P-E-N-E-R, Philip Spener, began home Bible meetings. And this was in Germany now. And Germany, by this time, by 1670, like 100 years after the Reformation, Germany was cold. I mean, theologically cold. The Lutheran Church had become a cold theological church. And so Spener began home Bible meetings, and they were dubbed, advertised, whatever, as gatherings to foster piety. And so pietism began to grow, like a new wave of spirituality began to emerge in the Lutheran Church. And some of the people that came out of this pietism became missionaries under the leadership of August Franke, F-R-A-N-C-K-E. Now, one of these pietists was Nicholas von Zinzendorf. Von Zinzendorf, you see his name written down here, and he aided some of the Bohemian Brethren who were being led by Christian David. Remember, the Bohemian Brethren were the descendants of John Huss. They were some of the Taborites that broke off and became the United Brethren or the Bohemian Brethren. And they finally settled in Moravia, and they're helped by Zinzendorf, and they became Moravians because of where they settled, and they became the first Protestant missionaries. Unitarianism. Just a list of these movements going down the line before we come to John Wesley here. Unitarianism. In 1579, a man by the name of Socinius published his doctrinal views in Poland under the title of the Rakovian Catechism. See, a catechism is a question and answer booklet, like in the Roman Catholic Catechism. It says, "Why did God make me?" Good question. Why did God make me? Answer: God made me to know Him, to love Him, and to serve Him in this world, and to be happy with Him in the next. That's about the second or third question in the Roman Catholic Catechism. So a catechism is a formulation of doctrine in question and answer form. So this Rakovian Catechism set forth the theological views of Socinius. And in fact, the teaching became known as Socinianism. He denied the Trinity. He denied that there are three persons in one God. He denied the deity of Christ. He denied the blood atonement. And an Englishman by the name of Theophilus Lindsay picked this up, and he established the Unitarian Church. Unitarian, that speaks of a denial of the Trinity, say Unitarian Church in England. And he taught salvation by character, not by the blood of Jesus. Salvation by good works. Salvation by character. That's the flaw, and that's the theology of Unitarianism. Modernism. Modernism. We hear a lot about modernism. We hear more about humanism today. Humanism is really an offshoot of modernism, I believe. Modernism was spawned by science and modern philosophy. Man began to rationalize away the supernatural. So science and modern philosophy brought forth modernism. It embraced a denial of the supernatural. It embraced a denial of the deity of Christ. It says, modernism says that the Bible is only a record of man's religious experiences. And modernism has come into a lot of Protestant churches. It's a denial of the supernatural. The Bible is like a history book or a record of man's religious experience and so forth. Now, modernism was condemned as an error in 1907 by Pope Pius X. That's his great claim to fame. He condemned modernism, and rightly so. He condemned this watering down nature of Jesus Christ, the destruction of it, and the watering down of the Scriptures and the watering down of the supernatural. All of which now brings us to John Wesley. You all heard of John Wesley and the Methodists. He was ordained an Anglican priest. So Wesley, there's Wesley up there on the screen. He was an Anglican, not a Roman Catholic. He was an Anglican priest. And he was so ordained in 1728. And he and his brother formed the Holy Club at Oxford University for the spiritual welfare of the students there. And they committed themselves to a disciplined form of prayer and study, so they became known as Methodists because they were under a regular discipline of prayer and study. Now, Wesley joined George Whitefield in open-air preaching, and in 1739. England was in a terrible spiritual condition in those days. And John Wesley had a 50-year ministry, Up on your screen, you'll see John Wesley preaching to the coal miners. He's a man to go out there with the people. And Wesley was organized. He's a good preacher, but he was an organizer. And he gathered people into Methodist societies. And then he would visit these different groups. And he began to meet annually, yearly in London with his lay preachers. He let a lot of people preach, a lot of laymen. People who were not clergy. He let them preach. And this is the beginning of the annual conference of the Methodist Church. The lay preachers under John Wesley would come together in London once a year, and he would meet with them, and that's the historical beginnings of the quite well-known annual conference of the Methodist Church. Eventually, the mission field, the ministering field, was divided into circuits. Certain preachers were assigned to travel into certain areas. So they would make a circuit. They would go around. They would make a circuit and go around and cover one area. So they might come to one particular town once a month, but they would go around and stay there for a few days and move on to the next town, then come back maybe in a month or 2 months and minister again. So that would be a circuit. And each circuit was placed under a superintendent. So it was all well organized. So, very important now, Wesley began using lay preachers. And in time, he wanted to ordain these lay preachers, have them ordained by the Church of England. See, Wesley was a priest, as it were, of the Church of England. He was an Anglican priest. And so he wanted the Church of England to ordain these lay preachers, but as far as the Church of England went, these men did not qualify for ordination, didn't have the education, so forth. So the Anglican bishops refused, so John ordains the men himself. He ordained these men all by himself, and he didn't realize that he was breaking away from the Anglican Church when he did that, but that's what he did. So John ordained 2 lay preachers as ministers in 1784, and so he actually broke away by doing this from the Anglican Church without realizing it. And in 1784, Francis Asbury and Thomas Coke became superintendents of the Methodist Church in America. They sent Asbury and Coke to America to superintend the Methodist Church. More men were ordained, and a creed or a statement of belief and a liturgy, a form of worship, were adopted. During this time, John Wesley rode 250,000 miles on horseback throughout England and Scotland and Ireland. John Wesley rode 250,000 miles on horseback in England in Scotland and Ireland. He preached 42,000 sermons, and he wrote 50 books. He wrote 50 books. You wonder how man had that kind of time, but he did it. Got to be the Spirit of God. He preached everywhere, especially to workers and the unchurched. He said, and you know what he said. He said, the world is my parish. He said, well, I'm not responsible for those people over there. God put me here. I'm responsible. The world was, Jesus said, go to all nations preaching the gospel. Well, he did, literally, as many as he could. He said, the world is my parish. The world is my place of ministry. In 1784, by a deed of declaration, Wesley provided for the continuance of his organization. And he died in 1791, but only after his death was the Methodist Church as such established as a separate church from the Church of England. Now I come to George Whitefield. George Whitefield. He was an ordained Anglican minister. He had gone to Oxford University. He preached revival like Wesley did. Now Whitefield was very Calvinistic. Whitefield and Wesley didn't always agree in their theology, but they worked together. And they preached together. And they preached together in great open-air meetings. Whitefield was Calvinistic in theology. His followers remained in the Anglican Church, though. And the followers of Whitefield formed the Low Church. The Low Church, or the Evangelical Party. So they were moderate Calvinists as opposed, and they opposed elaborate ritual. See, they're Low Church, the High Church, and the Middle Church. In the Church of England, you got three branches of it. You got the High Church, which is very, very liturgical, a lot of ritual. That's very much like the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, you would think it was the Roman Catholic Church by looking at it, except they don't believe that the Pope is the head. Then you have the Low Church, which is hardly any liturgy at all. Then you got the Broad Church, which is very, very, very liberal and accepts just about anything. Wesley and Whitefield had a tremendous effect on the Anglican Church. And some felt that the Anglican Church would cease and diminish from being the state church of England. It got to a point that because of the Low Church and the Broad Church and so forth and other influences, it looked like the state, like things were going would so change that the Anglican Church, as far as the High Church thing, would diminish, and it looked like the Anglican Church might even cease to be the state church of England. Therefore, there was some in the Anglican Church that wanted to preserve the High Church, preserve the ritual, and preserve the Anglican Church as the state church. So these people were known as the High Church Party, the High Church Party. And they sought to lead the Anglican Church closer to Rome. So there's a move back toward Rome here in the High Church element of the English state church, the Anglican Church. There's an element there, people in the High Church, they want to get back to Rome and get back to closer identification with Rome. So the leaders of this movement back toward Rome, surprisingly enough, that such a thing would ever happen. Elizabeth must have turned over in her grave, and but the leaders of this movement were mostly from Oxford University. So it's called the Oxford Movement. The Oxford Movement, where a group of, was a movement led by professors, teachers, instructors at Oxford University to lead the English church back to Rome. The leaders were John Cabell, Edward Posey, John Henry Newman. John Henry Newman was a bishop in the Anglican Church. John Henry Newman left the Anglican Church and himself became a Roman Catholic, eventually became a cardinal, a Roman Catholic cardinal bishop, the highest rank of a Roman Catholic bishop, just short of the papacy. So John Henry Cardinal Newman was a very famous convert to Roman Catholicism out of the Oxford movement. Samuel Coleridge, he wanted a state church in England that tolerated all beliefs. So Coleridge wanted a state church in England that tolerated all beliefs. He didn't want any just one church being the state church. He wanted a state church that would tolerate everybody else. This resulted in the Broad Church party within the Anglican Church. As I said before, they were very, very liberal. So in the Anglican Church, you had the High Church, very much like the Roman Church, very liturgical, ecclesiastical, Gothic, you might say. Then you had the Low Church, the Whitefield group, hardly identified even as Anglican. Then you had the Broad Church that wanted to include tolerance for everybody, and they were very, very liberal. So you had the High, Low, and the Broad, and you still do. Now, during the 19th century, groups of nonconformists to the Anglican Church grew. So about half the population fell out of harmony by the 19th century, by the 1800s. About half the population fell out of harmony with the Anglican Church. And among these were Edward Irving. Edward Irving, he was a Presbyterian minister. He preached tongues. He preached healing. He preached prophecy. And so he was kicked out of the Presbyterian Church. And he began his own church called the Catholic Apostolic Church. The Catholic, nothing to do with Roman Catholicism. They call it the Catholic Apostolic Church. He appointed 12 apostles, established this Catholic Apostolic Church, and they are commonly known as the Irvingites. Then among these dissenters, you had the Salvation Army. Salvation Army was developed in 1878 in England under a Methodist minister. William Booth was a Methodist minister. He established the Salvation Army in 1878 through evangelism and social work. He stretched out his hand to the down and out people. You know, he began this work because the down and out people, the down and outers, were not accepted in the Anglican Church because they weren't good enough. So Booth, a Methodist minister, established the Salvation Army to reach out to the unchurched who were not considered socially acceptable in the regular churches. Then you have the Young Men's Christian Association, or the YMCA, organized by George Williams in England in 1844, and his desire was to meet the social needs and the physical exercise needs of men, and of course this came to America, and its counterpart, the YWCA, was eventually established, and that was in 1855. Now, Catholic missionary work. How about a little thing on the Catholics here? Catholic missionary work. Between 1500 and 1600, the Catholic Portuguese and the Catholic Spanish made voyages of discovery to the New World between 1500 and 1600. The Catholic Church had the foreign mission field to themselves for 150 years, between 1500 and 1650, during the whole time of the Protestant Reformation. See, the first Protestant missionaries were the Moravians of the 16th century. Well, before the Protestants went out, the Roman Catholics had been on the mission field for about 150 years. They had no competition because there's no Protestantism to evangelize anybody. So the Protestant missionary effort did not begin until the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, and at the end of the 30 Years' War. So South and Central America, as well as Mexico, were brought into the Catholic Church by Spanish missionaries. They had free reign. They were the only missionaries over here. Were Catholic ones for 150 years. So no wonder South America, Central America, and the southern tier of the United States and parts of the West Coast are so Catholic, and Canada are so Catholic, because that's where the Catholic missionaries were laboring before the development of Protestantism and the ability of quote, Protestants to send out missionaries themselves. So the missionaries were mostly Jesuits, Spanish missionaries. The Jesuits, I say Jesuits, they are members of the Society of Jesus, established by a Spanish man by the name of Ignatius of Loyola. Ignatius of Loyola began the Catholic religious order of men known as the Society of Jesus, called Jesuits. It's a short form for Jesusites, I guess, the Society of Jesus. So they're called Jesuits. And the Spanish missionaries also established churches not only in Canada, but in Florida, in California, in Mexico. The Franciscans labored in California. And the French Jesuits brought the Catholic faith from Quebec down the Mississippi Valley and to Louisiana. Now the Protestant missionary effort, we spoke some about this. We have the Pietists under Frank. They began, or otherwise known as the Moravians, they began the Protestant effort. Christian Schwartz labored in India, 1750 to 1798. These are Protestants. From 1732, the Moravians have been involved in missionary work. And the Moravians still minister today. And they ministered to the North American Indians in 1745. Which finally brings us to William Carey. William Carey, 1761. William Carey, see his picture up there on the screen, is known as the father of modern missions. He is the father of modern missions. He's from England. He organized the original Baptist Mission Society in 1793. And he went to India, and he helped translate the Bible into 26 Indian languages. William Carey, the father of modern missions. Well, we will continue next time with Christianity in America.